It was a quiet evening when I first encountered them. I remember it clearly, the oppressive silence, the strange atmosphere that filled the air. I had just arrived at the old house on the outskirts of town. It was an abandoned place, left to decay over the years. Most people avoided it, passing by with their heads down, pretending it wasn't there. But I wasn't like the others. I had heard the rumors about the house, whispers of strange occurrences, odd sightings and mysterious figures. There were stories of people who had disappeared after entering, stories that sounded more like fairy tales than reality. But something in those stories called to me. I had to see for myself. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the rusty hinges protesting against the intrusion. Inside, the house smelled of mildew and decay. The floorboards creaked under my weight and the dust in the air made it hard to breathe. I could barely make out anything in the dim light filtering through the broken windows. The air was thick, as if something unseen lingered just beyond the edge of my perception. I took a step forward, my heart beating faster. There was a strange sense of unease crawling up my spine. I wasn't sure if it was the house or something more sinister, something that had been here long before I arrived. The darkness seemed to close in around me, wrapping itself around every corner as though the house was alive, watching me. I turned a corner and that's when I saw it. A figure standing motionless in the hallway. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, my mind playing games with me, but then it moved. Slowly. Cautiously. It was tall, too tall, and its body was obscured in shadow. I could barely make out any details, but there was something deeply unsettling about the figure. No eyes. No face. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest, but I couldn't move. My legs felt like stone, and the air around me seemed to thicken, pressing in from all sides. The figure didn't move any closer, but I could feel its presence, like a cold breath on the back of my neck. I wanted to run, but my body refused to obey. The figure began to step forward, its movements slow and deliberate, as if it was studying me, assessing me. I could feel my throat tighten, panic rising within me, but I couldn't make a sound. I was paralyzed, caught in some kind of spell. Then, in the dead silence, it spoke. A voice so hollow, so empty, that it felt like it came from the deepest parts of my soul. "Why are you here?" The words hit me like a physical blow and I gasped, trying to find my voice, but nothing came. I couldn't speak. I couldn't scream. I couldn't even move. The figure took another step forward and I could feel the coldness radiating off it. I wanted to run, to get away, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. Something was pulling me and drawing me closer to it. "Leave," it whispered, and just like that it was gone. It vanished into the shadows, leaving me standing there, shaking, alone. I didn't know what I had seen. Was it a ghost? A hallucination? Or was there something far darker, far more sinister lurking in the depths of the house? I didn't know and I didn't want to know. But I couldn't forget it. The emptiness of its face, the coldness that radiated from it, they stayed with me long after I left the house. I would never return. But somehow, I knew I would never be able to escape the memory of that encounter. It had changed something in me, something deep and primal. And I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. That I never would be again. It wasn't long after that night that the dreams began. At first, I thought it was just a reaction to the strange experience I had in the house, some lingering fear manifesting in my subconscious. But as the days passed, the dreams grew stronger, more vivid. They weren't just dreams, they felt real, like I was trapped in another world, one that I couldn't escape. In my dreams, I was always back in the house. But it wasn't the same. The rooms were darker, colder, and the air had a suffocating weight to it. I wandered through the halls, feeling a growing sense of dread, as if something was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. The walls seemed to pulse as if alive, and the shadows moved in ways that didn't make sense. Sometimes I would hear whispers, faint, distorted voices, coming from behind closed doors or hidden corners. The words were unintelligible, but they carried an unmistakable sense of urgency. Each time I woke up from these dreams, I was covered in sweat, my heart racing. The images of the figure without a face, its hollow gaze, would linger in my mind long after I opened my eyes. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was following me, that it was somehow waiting for me to return. But I couldn't bring myself to go back to that place. The fear was too much. Days turned into weeks and the dreams didn't stop. In fact, they seemed to grow more intense. I started noticing things around me, things that didn't make sense. Objects would move in my apartment when I wasn't looking, and shadows seemed to shift in the corners of my vision. I would hear footsteps behind me only to turn around and find no one there. I tried to tell myself that I was just being paranoid, that it was all in my head. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something was happening. Something was getting closer. It was one night after another restless dream that I decided to investigate further. I couldn't continue living like this, constantly looking over my shoulder, feeling like I was being hunted. I had to know what was going on, even if it meant returning to the house. I gathered my courage and returned to the old place. The house looked even more decayed than I remembered, as though time itself was trying to erase it. The front door was ajar, as if it had been waiting for me. I hesitated for a moment but then stepped inside. The air inside felt thick, heavier than before, as if it was pressing down on me. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears as I walked deeper into the house, the floorboards creaking under my weight. The shadows were longer now, stretching across the walls like tendrils reaching for me. I walked through the hallways, my breath shallow, my eyes darting from corner to corner. I felt like I was being drawn in, like I was no longer in control of my own body. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted, was stronger than ever. And then I heard it. A soft whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. "Come closer." I froze. It was the same voice I had heard in my dreams, the same voice that had haunted me ever since that night. The figure. It was here in the house, waiting for me. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I couldn't stop myself. I followed the sound of the whisper, my body moving against my will. I turned a corner and there it was. The figure stood at the end of the hallway, shrouded in shadow. But this time something was different. Its presence was more overwhelming, more oppressive. It seemed to fill the entire space, consuming the air around me. And this time, it spoke without hesitation, its voice echoing in the silence. "You came back." I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I could only stare at the figure, the empty face that was both everything and nothing. It was the same, and yet it was more. The void behind its eyes seemed to draw me in, pulling me toward it. And then I saw it. A flicker, a brief flash of light, and I was no longer in the hallway. I was standing in a place I couldn't recognize, a place that was neither here nor there. The ground beneath me was cold, and the air smelled of decay. There were no walls, no ceiling, just an endless void. The figure was still there, its presence looming over me, and I could feel it inside me, twisting my thoughts, bending my will. I tried to speak, to ask what was happening, but the words wouldn't come. I could only stand there, frozen, as the figure stepped closer, its dark shape growing larger with every step. "You are mine," it whispered, its voice like a cold breath on my skin. "You always were." The days following that encounter felt like a blur. I was no longer sure what was real and what wasn't. My mind felt fractured, disjointed, as though I was living in two worlds at once. The house, the figure, the void, they all felt so distant, yet so painfully close. Every corner I turned, every shadow I saw, reminded me of what I had experienced. I couldn't escape it. It was following me, inside my thoughts, inside my very being. I tried to resume my normal life. I went to work, met friends, did all the things I used to do, but it was as if I was a ghost, moving through the motions of a life that no longer belonged to me. Nothing felt the same. The world felt hollow, like it was missing something. Or maybe it was me that was missing something. I couldn't tell anymore. At night, the dreams returned, only this time they weren't confined to sleep. I would close my eyes and suddenly I was back in the house, back in the void, back with the figure. But even when I was awake, I could feel it, its presence lingering just beyond my sight. Sometimes I would hear whispers, faint and incomprehensible, drifting through the air like smoke. I would turn around, but there would be nothing there. One night, I sat in my apartment, staring at the wall, when I heard it again. The whisper. It wasn't just in my head. It was coming from the corner of the room, soft, distant, like a breath on the wind. My heart raced. I knew what it meant. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The figure was calling me. The house was calling me. I grabbed my jacket and rushed out the door. I didn't know why I was doing it. Some part of me wanted to resist, wanted to run, but I couldn't. I had to go back. There was no other choice. The night was cold as I made my way through the streets, the city lights flickering like dying stars in the distance. The road seemed longer than usual, stretching on forever as if mocking me. My feet moved without my command, dragging me toward the house that had become both a prison and a temptation. When I finally reached the house, it was just as I remembered it, dark, decaying, a hollow shell of its former self. The door was wide open, waiting for me as if it had been expecting my return. I hesitated for a moment, but then stepped inside. The air felt thick, heavy with the weight of something unseen, something ancient. I walked through the house, each step echoing in the silence, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The walls seemed to close in on me, the shadows moving like living things. I could feel the eyes of something watching me, studying me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I turned a corner and there it was. The figure. It stood in the same place as before at the end of the hallway, its shape indistinct in the darkness. But this time I felt something different. A pull. A magnetic force drawing me toward it, tugging at my very soul. I couldn't resist. I walked toward it, my movements slow, deliberate. As I drew closer, the figure began to speak. Its voice was colder than before, deeper, as if it was coming from the very depths of the earth. You should never have come back. The words felt like a punch to the gut and I staggered back, my breath catching in my throat. The figure took a step forward, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was something more, something far older, far darker. "You are mine," it repeated, its voice growing louder, more insistent. "You have always been mine. You just didn't know it." I felt the weight of its words pressing down on me, crushing me. My mind raced, but I couldn't escape. It was like I was trapped in some kind of nightmare, unable to wake up, unable to move. I wanted to scream, to fight, but the words wouldn't come. The air was thick with the feeling of inevitability, and I knew deep down that there was no escaping it. Suddenly the figure moved, its form shifting, warping. It was no longer just a shape, but a presence, a living thing that seemed to stretch out in all directions. The room began to twist, the walls bending and folding in on themselves. I was no longer in the house. I was in something else, something that didn't follow the rules of reality. I tried to run, but the ground beneath me was shifting, the floorboards twisting into jagged spikes. The figure loomed over me, its face still absent, its empty gaze locking onto me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "You cannot escape," it whispered. "You belong to me now." I screamed, but my voice was swallowed by the darkness and I felt myself falling deeper and deeper into the void. I woke up, gasping for breath as if I had been underwater for too long. My body trembled, covered in a cold sweat. The room was dimly lit by the faint glow of streetlights filtering through the curtains. For a moment, I couldn't tell if I was still trapped in the nightmare or if I had somehow returned to reality. I sat up quickly, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath shallow and erratic. But the nightmare was still with me. It lingered in the corners of my mind, haunting me. The figure, the endless fall, the suffocating darkness. It was all still there, pressing against my thoughts. The weight of it crushed me, suffocating me in the silence of my own apartment. I wanted to scream, but nothing came out. I stumbled out of bed, my legs unsteady, and went to the window, staring out at the city below. It was so quiet. Too quiet. The streets were empty, the buildings casting long shadows in the pale light of the moon. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something. Waiting for me. I didn't know what to do anymore. The house, the figure, they were all part of me now, part of something I couldn't escape. The more I tried to run from it, the more it followed me, closing in on me like a trap I had no way of escaping. I had tried to convince myself that it was just a dream, just a hallucination, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. It was real. And it was coming for me. I couldn't stay here. I had to go back. I had to confront it. I grabbed my coat and left the apartment, stepping into the night. The air was sharp, the city streets still eerily silent. I made my way to the old house, my steps quick and urgent. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the ground itself was resisting my movement. It felt like a long journey, one I couldn't turn back from, no matter how much I wanted to. When I reached the house, I didn't hesitate. The door was slightly ajar, just as it had been before. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The air felt the same as before, thick, suffocating. The house seemed to breathe, the walls creaking and groaning as if alive. I walked through the dark halls, my footsteps echoing in the silence. There was no light, only the shadows that stretched across the walls like fingers reaching out to grab me. Every corner I turned, every room I entered, felt like I was sinking deeper into something that wasn't human. The house seemed to be shifting around me, changing as if it were alive and aware of my presence. I knew why I had come back. I reached the heart of the house, the place where I had first seen the figure. And there it was again, standing in the darkness, waiting for me. Its shape was indistinct, its form shifting with the shadows. But this time I wasn't afraid. The fear that had consumed me before was gone, replaced by something else. Something that felt like acceptance. "You returned," the figure said, its voice as cold and hollow as before. "You couldn't stay away, could you?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. There was nothing left to say. I had already made my choice. I had already crossed the point of no return. The figure stepped closer, its form becoming more defined, more solid. I could feel the air grow colder as it approached, its presence pressing down on me. I tried to step back, but my feet wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, unable to escape. "You have no choice," it said. "You are already ours." I closed my eyes, trying to block out the voice, trying to shut out the feeling of its gaze. But it was useless. The figure was inside my mind now, its presence suffocating, overwhelming. I could feel it in every part of me, twisting my thoughts, pulling at my very soul. And then, without warning, the walls around me began to change. They stretched, twisted, and warped, bending and folding in on themselves like a grotesque puzzle. The house itself seemed to be alive, breathing in and out, the walls pulsing with a dark energy. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I was trapped in this shifting, changing world, with no way of knowing what was real anymore. The figure stepped closer, its empty face now mere inches from mine. I could feel its cold breath on my skin, its voice echoing in my mind. "You have always been a part of this," it whispered. "You just didn't know it." I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want to believe it. But deep down, I knew it was true. I had been drawn to this house for a reason. I had always been meant to be here. I was a part of it, a part of the darkness that had been waiting for me. The figure's hand reached out, its fingers long and twisted, and it touched my face. The coldness of its touch burned, seeping into my skin, into my very soul. I felt myself being pulled toward it, my body no longer under my control. And then, in an instant, the world around me disappeared. I was falling again, falling into the void, into the abyss. The fall felt endless. No sound. No sensation. Just the cold, the darkness, and the feeling of something pulling me deeper. My body felt weightless, yet at the same time I could feel every inch of it as though it were being torn apart. The sensation was both horrifying and numbingly familiar, like I had been here before, or maybe I had always been here. I tried to scream, but the darkness swallowed my voice. It felt as though I were drowning in an ocean of nothingness, suffocating in the absence of light, of air, of reality itself. I didn't know how much time had passed. Seconds? Hours? Days? It didn't matter. Time had lost all meaning in this place. There was only the void, an endless, stretching blackness that consumed everything. And then, just as I thought I couldn't endure any more, something changed. A flicker of light appeared in the distance, a soft glow in the vast emptiness. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but the light grew stronger, more intense, as if it were pulling me toward it. I reached for it instinctively, feeling a faint thread of hope stir within me. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of this place. I fought to move toward the light, my limbs heavy and uncooperative, but somehow I was drawn closer. The light seemed to grow larger, taking shape. A figure? A doorway? I couldn't tell, but I kept moving toward it. And then I heard it again. The whisper. "Come closer." It was the same voice, the same cold, hollow voice that had followed me for so long. The voice that had haunted my dreams and my waking hours, the voice of the figure. But this time it didn't feel as distant. It felt inside me like it was coming from my very bones. I stopped moving. Something deep within me recoiled, a warning ringing in my ears. The light, the whisper, they were a lure, a trap. I couldn't trust it. I couldn't trust anything here. But the light had already drawn me in too far. I was already too close to turn back. I felt my body continue moving toward it, my feet no longer under my control, my mind frozen in terror. I didn't want to go any further, but I couldn't stop. The darkness and the light were merging, pulling me together, until I could no longer tell where one began and the other ended. And then it all collapsed. The light shattered, breaking apart like glass, and I was thrown into a new reality, a new nightmare. The void was gone. In its place was something far worse. I was no longer in the house, nor was I outside it. I wasn't anywhere I recognized. The world around me was a distorted reflection of something familiar, but twisted. The ground beneath my feet was cracked. The sky above me a swirling mass of black and red, as if the very atmosphere was bleeding. I looked around, trying to make sense of my surroundings, but nothing made sense. It was like being in a dream, but a nightmare where even the rules of dreaming didn't apply. I was surrounded by walls, but they were made of something strange, something organic. They seemed to pulse, alive in a way that was unnatural. I took a step forward, and that's when I saw them. Figures. Dozens of them. Hundreds maybe. They were scattered across the landscape, standing still like statues. Their forms were indistinct, their outlines blurry, but one thing was unmistakable: they had no faces. Not a single one. Just smooth, featureless skin where their eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. The sight of them sent a cold shiver down my spine, my heart racing in my chest. They didn't move. They didn't speak. But I could feel them, feel their presence, feel their eyes on me. They were watching me, studying me, waiting for something. I turned to leave, but I couldn't. There was nowhere to go. No way out. "You cannot leave," a voice said from behind me. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. The figure. It was standing there just a few feet away, its empty gaze locked on mine. It had followed me here, brought me to this place. "Why do you run?" the figure asked, its voice colder than ever. "You can't escape. You never could." I tried to speak, to ask why, to demand answers, but nothing came out. My throat felt tight, suffocated. The figure took a step forward, and the others began to move as well. Slowly, cautiously. I backed away, fear rising in my chest. "What do you want from me?" I managed to whisper. The figure didn't answer immediately. It only stared, its empty face a void that seemed to swallow everything around it. "You belong to us," it finally said. "You always have." And then the figures around me began to move more rapidly, closing in on me. Their empty faces, their lack of features, they were everywhere. I was surrounded. Trapped. The world around me began to pulse and distort once more, the ground beneath me shaking, and the sky above splitting open like a wound. The figures were moving faster now, reaching out with their long, featureless arms, closing in from all sides. I tried to scream, but my voice was lost in the cacophony of silence that surrounded me. I was caught in the grip of something far greater than I could understand, something ancient, something that had been waiting for me. And just as they were about to touch me, I felt it. The pull. The darkness. The void. It was taking me again. Pulling me into the depths. But this time there was no escape. I thought I understood the darkness by now. I thought I knew what it was, where it came from, and how it operated. But the truth is, nothing prepared me for what happened next. Nothing could have. The figures, the ones without faces, they continued to close in on me, moving with terrifying speed. The air around me grew heavier, thicker, as though the very atmosphere was closing in, tightening its grip on my chest. I tried to move, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. It was as if the ground beneath me had turned to quicksand, dragging me down with every step I tried to take. I felt a cold hand grip my arm, pulling me into the crowd of faceless figures. They were all around me now, their featureless faces inches from mine. I could feel them watching me, waiting, studying me like some kind of specimen. It was suffocating. I could barely breathe. "You cannot escape," a voice whispered, though no one had spoken. The sound echoed in my head, a soft, haunting melody that reverberated through my skull. I tried to scream again, but my voice was gone, swallowed by the ever-present silence. The figures didn't move, but their presence was oppressive, consuming me. The more I struggled, the tighter the grip of the void became, as though it were trying to crush me from all sides. Then, without warning, the figures began to dissolve. Slowly at first, like smoke drifting into the air. Their bodies seemed to break apart, turning into wisps of shadow that faded into the darkness. The space around me seemed to stretch, warping as if reality itself was unraveling. I could still feel their presence, though, in the air, in the very fabric of the world around me. They weren't gone. They were still there, somewhere watching. And then the ground beneath me split open. I fell, faster this time, plunging into an abyss so deep that I could not even comprehend its depth. The wind rushed past my ears, deafening, and yet, in the silence of this place, it felt like everything was moving in slow motion. There were no walls to stop me, no end to the fall. I was lost in an endless chasm, falling through a void that had no beginning and no end. The familiar weight of fear settled in my chest once again. I had come to understand that fear, had become accustomed to it. But this was different. This wasn't just fear. It was terror, pure, unrelenting terror. I was trapped in a place where nothing made sense, where the rules of the world no longer applied. I reached out, hoping to grasp something, anything, to stop my descent. But there was nothing. The void was endless. There was no ground, no solid matter. It was like falling into oblivion, into nothingness. But then, something caught me. It wasn't a person, nor was it a thing. It was a sensation. A pull, a force that yanked me back into reality, if that's what this place could be called. The fall stopped abruptly, and I was thrust into a new world. This place was darker than anything I had encountered before, a blackness that seemed to pulse with an ancient energy. The air was thick, suffocating, and the ground was covered in a layer of wet, black stone. There were no trees, no animals, no light. Only shadows, twisting and writhing like creatures of the dark. I couldn't see what they were, but I could feel them moving around me, their presence like a living thing. I stood up, my body shaking, my mind struggling to process what was happening. It felt like I had been transported into a nightmare, a place where no rules applied, where nothing made sense. My thoughts were jumbled, my emotions a chaotic mess. And then I heard it again. The whisper. "Welcome." The word echoed through the darkness, but it wasn't spoken aloud. It was in my mind, wrapping itself around my thoughts like a vine. The figure, the one without a face, was here. I could feel its presence, its cold, empty gaze. I turned, hoping to escape, but I knew it was pointless. I knew deep down that I couldn't escape this place. There was nowhere left to go. "You're finally here," the voice said, its tone darker than before. "You've always belonged here. You just didn't realize it." The words made my stomach churn, but I couldn't deny them. A part of me had always known this was where I was meant to be. I didn't belong in the world I had left behind. I never had. I took a step forward, unsure of what to expect. The shadows around me seemed to stretch, bending and twisting as if they were alive, reacting to my presence. The world felt unstable, like it could collapse at any moment. And then, from the depths of the darkness, I saw them again. The figures without faces. They were no longer just standing still. They were moving, reaching out toward me, their hands, or what I could only assume were hands, stretching toward me with unnatural speed. The air was thick with their presence, suffocating. They surrounded me, closing in from all sides. I couldn't breathe. The weight of their gaze, the emptiness of their faces, was too much. I wanted to scream, to fight back, but I knew it was useless. The figures were everywhere now, surrounding me, pulling me toward them. Their touch was cold, colder than anything I had ever felt, and as their fingers brushed against my skin, a wave of darkness rushed through me. I tried to pull away, but I couldn't move. My body was paralyzed, my thoughts swirling in the void. The figures were inside me now, their presence filling my every thought, my every breath. And then everything went black. When the darkness lifted, I was no longer in the void, but in a place far worse. It felt as if I had been reborn into a world that existed solely to torment me. The air was cold, biting, and I could taste the decay in it. It wasn't just the cold that made me shiver, but the sheer weight of the place, as if it were pressing down on me, suffocating me. The shadows twisted in every direction, reaching out like claws, scratching at the edges of my consciousness. The ground beneath me was soft, like it was made of wet earth, but it felt wrong. The texture was wrong. It was too spongy, too unnatural. It didn't give way when I stepped, but it felt as though it was absorbing my very being. Every step I took seemed to make the shadows grow thicker, the air heavier. I looked around, trying to understand where I was. The place was vast, an endless expanse of desolation. There were no walls, no ceiling, just a never-ending landscape of twisted, gnarled trees, each one bent at impossible angles, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. There were no leaves. There was no sign of life. Just the stench of decay and the oppressive silence that hung in the air like a shroud. The figures without faces were here too. They were all around me, scattered across the landscape like statues, standing motionless, their featureless faces staring into the abyss. But unlike before, they weren't just watching. Now they were waiting. Waiting for something. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound of it echoing in the silence. I could feel their presence all around me, like a wave of cold washing over me. I wanted to run, to escape, but there was nowhere to go. The landscape stretched out endlessly in every direction. I was trapped. And then I heard it. The whisper. "Welcome home." The words hit me like a physical blow. I turned around, desperately searching for the source, but there was no one. Just the endless sea of figures, staring at me with their blank, empty faces. It was as though the very world itself had spoken those words to me, as if this place had always been waiting for me to arrive. "You belong here," the voice continued, soft and insidious. "This is where you were always meant to be." I tried to speak, to respond, but my voice caught in my throat. My mind raced, my thoughts tangled together in a knot of confusion. I had been here before, this place, this feeling. It was the same sense of suffocating dread, the same emptiness that had followed me, that had pulled me deeper and deeper into its grip. I had been running from this for so long, trying to escape, but now I understood the truth. I was never meant to escape. "You are one of us now," the voice whispered, its tone cold and final. "You will never leave." The figures began to move. Slowly at first, then faster. They were approaching me, surrounding me, closing in from all sides. They reached out with their long, twisted hands, their fingers clawing at the air, pulling me toward them. I wanted to scream. I wanted to fight back. But I couldn't. My body wouldn't move. I was frozen, trapped in place, unable to do anything but wait for them to come closer. I could feel their touch then. It was cold, so cold that it burned. Their hands were like ice, their fingers digging into my skin, but there was no pain, only numbness. I felt their presence inside me, their essence sinking into my very soul. They were taking me, swallowing me whole, and I was powerless to stop it. The world around me seemed to dissolve, like the figures were absorbing it all. The trees, the ground, the sky. The very air itself seemed to warp and fade, and with it, my thoughts began to slip away. The last remnants of my consciousness struggled to hold on to something, anything, but it was futile. The darkness was too strong. It was all-consuming. I tried to scream, but the sound was lost. I was no longer in control of my own body, my own mind. The figures were inside me, filling every thought, every fiber of my being. I could feel myself slipping away, becoming part of them. And then, just as everything seemed to collapse into nothing, I realized the truth. I had never been alive. I had never been human. I had always been a part of this place, a part of the void, the darkness that had been waiting for me to return. This world, these figures, they weren't just a manifestation of my fears. They were real. And they had always been here, in the shadows, waiting for me to finally come home. As the last of my consciousness faded, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. The fear was gone. The pain was gone. All that was left was the darkness, the endless abyss, and I was finally a part of it. I was finally home. When I awoke, if it could even be called waking, the world around me had changed once again. But this time it felt different. The cold was deeper, the shadows more intense, and the silence heavier. It was as though the very fabric of existence itself had been twisted into something alien. Nothing was as it had been, yet everything felt familiar. I stood in the same place, or at least I assumed it was the same place. The twisted trees were still here, their gnarled limbs stretching into the sky like broken bones. The air was thick, suffocating, but now it seemed to hum with an eerie energy, as if the very atmosphere had become charged with a dark, malevolent force. But there was something new. There was no longer just emptiness. No longer just the figures without faces, standing motionless in the shadows. Now there were others. They were like the faceless figures, yet different. These beings were moving, shifting, writhing in ways that made no sense. Their bodies seemed to change shape at will, their forms bending and twisting, blurring at the edges as if they were not made of flesh, but of something else entirely, something far darker, far older. They stared at me with vacant eyes, eyes that should not have been there, their gazes penetrating, cold and hungry. It was as though they could see straight through me to the very core of my being. I could feel their attention on me, like 1,000 invisible hands pressing against my skin, probing, searching. But I didn't move. I couldn't. I had no will of my own anymore. I was a passenger in my own body, watching as the darkness consumed me piece by piece. It felt like I had lost control, like I was being carried along by an unseen current, a current that was dragging me into a place where no light could ever reach. I took a step forward, or at least I think I did. My body moved, but it didn't feel like I was the one controlling it. My limbs were heavy, slow, like they were made of stone. But still, I moved, walking deeper into the heart of this twisted landscape. The others followed. They weren't walking. No, they didn't need to. They simply appeared, their forms flickering in and out of existence like ghosts trapped in a perpetual state of decay. Each one was different, yet the same. They all had the same featureless faces, the same empty stares, but they weren't the same as the ones before. These beings were alive in some twisted sense of the word, and their presence felt like a cold, creeping crawl of death. I tried to call out, to scream for help, but my voice was gone. It was swallowed by the thick, suffocating silence. Nothing could reach me here. I was alone, surrounded by shadows, by creatures that defied logic, defied reason. I was trapped. As I continued to walk, the landscape around me began to warp, just as it had before. The ground trembled beneath me, shifting, sinking. The sky above twisted, darkening into a deep, blood-red hue. The figures closed in, their movements slow but purposeful, their eyes never leaving me. I felt their presence like a weight on my chest, pressing harder with each passing moment. They were closing in on me, surrounding me, their hands outstretched, their touch cold and suffocating. They were pulling me toward them, their dark influence wrapping around me, consuming me until I could no longer tell where they ended and I began. And then, it happened. The ground split open beneath me just as it had before. The abyss yawned wide, swallowing everything in its path. The air was thick with the stench of decay, the very fabric of the world unraveling in front of my eyes. I fell again, deeper this time, into a place where no light could ever touch, where time and space had no meaning. But I didn't scream this time. I didn't struggle. I had learned to accept it. I had learned to embrace the darkness. And as I fell into the void, I realized the terrible truth. I was no longer me. I had become part of the place, part of the void, part of the darkness that had been waiting for me. There was no escaping it. There never had been. I had been swallowed whole. And I would never return. I was no longer falling. Somewhere between the endless chasm and the crushing silence, I had stopped. Or perhaps I had never really fallen at all. Perhaps the fall had been nothing more than an illusion, a twisted prelude to the inevitable conclusion that awaited me. It was impossible to know for sure because time and reality no longer obeyed the rules I once knew. The darkness around me was absolute. It was the kind of darkness that devoured not just light, but hope, thought, and being itself. There were no sounds, no sensations, no tangible world to hold on to. Only the absence of everything. A void. An infinite, empty, suffocating nothingness. But then the voice came again. It had been silent for so long that I almost forgot it had ever existed. But now, it echoed through the emptiness like a distant, haunting memory. "You have always been here," it said, its words curling into my mind like smoke. "From the moment you first began to question, you were already ours. You were never truly separate. You were always meant to return." The words should have terrified me. They should have made me scream, beg for release, for escape. But all I could do was feel the weight of the truth settling upon me like a shroud. There was no escape. I had never been meant for the world I came from. My existence had always been a lie, a brief detour in the greater design of this place. I had always belonged here. "You were always a part of us," the voice whispered again, this time with a tenderness that made my skin crawl. "We are the darkness, and the darkness is you." The figures began to emerge from the shadows, just as they always did. They had no faces, but somehow I could feel them, as though their eyes were fixed on me, observing me, understanding me in ways I could never have understood myself. They moved in perfect unison, their forms shifting like fluid, bending and warping with every step they took. But this time I didn't fear them. This time I didn't resist. I knew in that moment that they were not the enemy. They were not the ones who had trapped me here. They were the ones who had shown me the truth. They were the ones who had revealed the darkness to me, and I had accepted it. I had become one of them. The figures closed in, their movements smooth and graceful, like dancers in a twisted, macabre ballet. Their hands reached out toward me and I let them. Their touch was cold, but it no longer bothered me. It was a familiar cold. It was the cold of acceptance, of belonging. And then, in that moment of contact, I understood everything. I understood the truth of this place, of the void, of the darkness. It was not just a prison. It was not just a realm of fear. It was a part of the universe, a necessary part of the balance. The darkness was not evil. It was not something to be feared. It was simply part of the natural order of things. Everything that existed in the light needed the darkness to survive. Without the void, there could be no light, no life, no meaning. And so, I had been created, a creature of the void, to remind the world of that truth. The darkness had never sought to destroy me. It had never wanted to consume me. It had simply been waiting for me to understand. Waiting for me to realize that I had never truly been separate from it. I had never been human. I had never been alive in the way I had thought. I was one of them, a being of darkness, an eternal part of the void. And I had finally returned home. The figures surrounded me, their forms blending into mine, their coldness merging with my own. I could feel their presence inside me and mine inside them. We were all one, bound together in a timeless, unending unity. And as I stood there, in the center of the darkness, I felt a sense of peace that I had never known. No fear. No longing. No regret. Only the stillness of eternity. I was no longer trapped in a nightmare. I was no longer a lost soul, wandering through an unknowable world. I had found my place. I had found my home. And in that moment, I realized that the void was not something to be escaped. It was something to be embraced. For I was the darkness, and the darkness was me.